Whispers of the untamed frontier paint a tale of vengeance tempered by wisdom, where a man's true strength lies not in the shadows of his past, but in the seeds he plants for tomorrow. In the rugged expanse of Nebraska Territory, 1868, they say, there lived a farmer whose hands could coax life from barren earth as skillfully as they could deliver death. Some dismiss it as another legend born in the embers of campfire tales. But those who witnessed the events that unfolded in Willow Creek Valley that fateful summer know the truth of what happens when cruel men mistake patience for weakness. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Willow Creek Valley carved its own humble corner of the Nebraska Territory, a precious strip of fertile land nestled between rolling hills and ancient forests. A single dirt road wound past weathered homesteads, connecting Bradley's General Store, the Mount Calvary Church, with its listing steeple, and the Rusty Spur Saloon, the only establishment where a man could wet his whistle for 20 miles, in any direction. Sarah Bradley, who'd run the general store since her husband answered the union's call and never returned, remembered the morning everything changed with perfect clarity. Winter's grip had finally loosened, and the first hints of spring painted the valley with tentative strokes of green. The store's bell chimed, and in walked a stranger leading a sturdy workhorse laden with farming equipment. He wasn't the type to draw attention. Average height, plain clothes that had seen honest wear, the kind of unremarkable features that could blend into any crowd. But Sarah hadn't survived 15 years on the frontier by taking things at face value. There was something about this stranger that made her instincts sharpen, like a hawk spotting movement in the grass. "Name's William Anderson," he said, voice as gentle as prairie wind. He purchased his supplies with careful consideration, each item selected with purpose. His hands caught her attention first. They were strong and calloused, but they moved with an unusual precision that seemed at odds with their weathered appearance. His eyes held a particular quality, taking in everything while appearing to focus on nothing, always aware of positions, distances, exits. Anderson bought the old Mitchell place on the valley's western edge, the one most folks said was too close to Blackwood Forest to farm safely, paid in clean banknotes, kept to himself, and started working that supposedly dangerous land with a precision that made even lifelong farmers pause and watch. Every morning before dawn, I painted the sky. He'd be out there, methodically clearing rocks, measuring rows with unusual exactness, setting fence posts with the careful attention of a man marking distances for something far more important than farming. Young Daniel Bradley, Sarah's 10-year-old son, took to watching Anderson's farm from the cover of a lightning-struck oak, fascinated by the stranger's methodical ways. The valley held its share of secrets in those days, and plenty of reasons to keep them. The soil in Willow Creek Valley wasn't just good, it was salvation. Natural springs fed the land year-round, making it a rare jewel in a region where drought could spell death for an entire season's hopes. That kind of blessing drew attention, and attention was the last thing the valley needed with the Raven Creek gang pushing south through the territory. Marcus Webb had started small, just another outlaw with quick hands and bigger dreams. But he was smarter than most, realizing that true power wasn't in quick raids and stolen horses, but in controlling the very thing that gave life to the frontier, water and the land it nourished. He'd already taken 2 valleys to the north, using a mixture of intimidation and violence to force farmers to sell their land for pennies on the dollar. Those who refused had a habit of discovering their barns ablaze in the dead of night, their wells fouled, their futures turned to ash. The Bradley family knew better than most what Webb was capable of. Sarah's cousin, James, had been sheriff in Promise Valley before the Raven Creek gang moved in. He tried to organize resistance, unite the farmers against Webb's pressure. They found him one morning in his own jail cell, shot through both hands before the killing shot, his badge replaced. With a black feather, Webb's calling card. Nobody paid much mind to William Anderson in those early days. He was just another farmer trying to coax life from stubborn earth. No one noticed how he'd sometimes pause in his work, head tilted just so, like he was listening for something far, beyond normal hearing. No one caught how his eyes would track riders passing on the road with the same careful attention he gave to plotting his furrows. Even when he came to town for supplies, he moved quiet as morning mist, watching, listening, and learning the valley's rhythms. Young Daniel Bradley was probably the first to suspect something wasn't quite what it seemed with the new farmer. One morning, as spring's warmth began to hint at summer's approach, he saw something that set his mind spinning. Anderson was mending a fence when a copperhead struck from beneath a sun-warmed rock. Without seeming to look, without even changing expression, Anderson's hand moved. The snake fell dead, its head nearly severed by a thrown fence staple. It was the kind of move that shouldn't have been possible. Too fast, too precise, like his hand knew where it needed to be before his mind gave the command. But that's just the beginning of the tale, for you need to understand what Willow Creek Valley was before the storm broke, before a single farmer showed an entire territory that sometimes the deadliest weapon isn't the gun a man carries openly, but the skill he keeps hidden behind quiet words and honest work. You need to understand what it means when a man who's spent his life perfecting the art of dealing death decides instead to pursue the art of nurturing life, and what happens when violent men mistake that choice for weakness. As spring deepened into summer, dark clouds gathered over Willow Creek Valley, though not a drop of rain fell from the Nebraska sky. Word of the Raven Creek gang's approach spread through the settlement like wildfire in drought season. They started subtle, the way a rattler tests its ground before striking. First came the scouts, just passing through, they said, asking casual questions about water rights and property boundaries. They'd stop at the Rusty Spur, loose with their money and freer with their threats, bragging about what happened to folks up north who didn't know how to be reasonable. Sheriff Robert Hayes watched it all from his office, worrying, etching deeper lines around his eyes. He was a good man, folks said, but good wasn't always enough against the kind of evil riding toward their valley. He'd known James Bradley, seen what happened when a lawman stood alone against Webb's pack. His badge felt heavier with each passing. A day, like it was cast from lead instead of tin. Through it all, William Anderson kept working his plot on the western edge, seemingly absorbed in his endless task of clearing fields and tending crops. But Sarah Bradley noticed how his hands would tighten on his tools when Webb's men rode past, like they were gripping something else entirely. She caught him one evening as he was buying supplies, his usual order of seeds and tools. "Have you heard about the Turners?" she asked, measuring out coffee beans with practiced precision. "Hard not to," Anderson replied, his voice soft as ever, but with something underneath it like steel wrapped in silk. "Webb's men were in here earlier, asking about you, about your water rights." Anderson's smile didn't change, but something in his eyes did. "Were they now? And what did you tell them, Miss Bradley? That you're just another fool trying to farm too close to Blackwood Forest?" She paused, then added lower, "But you're not, are you?" For a long moment, Anderson said nothing, just studied her with those two sharp eyes. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes, Miss Bradley, the best way to protect something isn't to fight for it outright. Sometimes you have to let it grow, nurture it until it's strong enough to stand on its own." As darkness fell over Willow Creek Valley that night, more riders were spotted heading south. The Raven Creek gang was coming in force, and Marcus Webb himself was leading them. What none of them knew was that a quiet farmer with calloused hands and a soldier's grace had been preparing for their arrival longer than anyone suspected. The war for Willow Creek Valley was about to begin, though not in the way anyone expected. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Marcus Webb rode into Willow Creek Valley at sunrise 3 days later, his appearance marking a stark contrast to the threatening rumors that preceded him. He didn't arrive with guns blazing or a show of overwhelming force. Instead, he came like a businessman, dressed in a pressed black coat with a signature raven feather pinned to his lapel, accompanied by just 4 riders. But there was nothing civilized about the fear that rippled through town at his approach, or the way his eyes calculated everything in terms of profit and pain. Sarah Bradley watched from her store window as Webb dismounted outside the Rusty Spur saloon. He moved with the fluid grace of a predator, his gun belt worn high and tight in the Kansas style, not a showman's rig, but a killer's tool. The black feather medallion caught the morning light, a silent reminder of countless lives destroyed. "Quite the quaint little community you've got here," Webb remarked, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent street. His accent held traces of Virginia gentleman, making his words all the more chilling. You'd think folks had never seen honest businessmen looking to invest in their future. The laugh that followed held no warmth, like wind through a boneyard. "Sheriff." Hayes emerged from his office, badge gleaming but his hand notably away from his gun. Smart man. Webb's riders had already spread out, taking positions that gave them clear lines of fire across the street. "Mr. Webb," Hayes said, his voice steady despite the tension. "We weren't expecting you. Best kind of visit, wouldn't you say?" Webb's smile never reached his eyes. "Keeps things honest. I hear you've got some of the finest farmland in the territory. Shame to see it worked by folks who don't have the resources to make the most of it." The exchange was interrupted by the arrival of William Anderson, walking down the street with a sack of seed corn over his shoulder. He seemed oblivious to the tension, to the way Webb's men had their hands near their guns. He simply continued his path, nodding politely to those he passed. Webb's attention snapped to the newcomer like a hawk spotting movement. "Don't believe we've met," he called out. "Marcus Webb at your service. I'm looking to invest in local properties, build something special here in Willow Creek Valley." Anderson set his sack down carefully before turning, his movements unhurried. "William Anderson," he replied simply, "just a farmer trying to make honest work pay." But Sarah, watching from her doorway, saw how he positioned himself, subtle, almost unconscious, but putting him in perfect view of all Webb's men while keeping the morning sun at his back. "Farmer?" Webb's eyes narrowed slightly. "Heard about your place out west. Blackwood Forest territory. Can't be easy making a living out there." "Good things rarely come easy, Mr. Webb." Anderson's voice remained mild, but something in his tone made Webb's closest rider shift uneasily in his saddle. "True enough. But life's full of opportunities if you know where to look. My associates and I might be interested in taking that burden off your hands. Fair price, of course." Anderson seemed to consider this, head tilted slightly as if listening to distant music. "Appreciate the offer," he said finally, "but I've put down roots. Hard thing to do in rocky soil. Makes you reluctant to pull them up." The temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Webb's smile became a razor's edge. "Roots can wither mighty quick in this climate. Seen it happen too many times. Man's better off taking a fair offer while it's on the table. Maybe." Anderson began adjusting his seed sack, his movements precise and measured. "But I've always believed that anything worth having is worth protecting. Whether it's crops pushing through stone or men standing their ground." Before Webb could respond, commotion erupted from the north end of town. A rider was coming in fast, one of Webb's scouts, his horse lathered and breathing hard. He dismounted in a rush, whispering urgently in his boss's ear. Whatever news he brought caused Webb's face to darken like a thunderhead. "We'll continue this discussion later," Webb said, his casual tone belied by the tension in his shoulders. He turned to Hayes. "Sheriff, you might want to ride out to Turner's place. Seems there's been another unfortunate accident." As Webb and his men rode north, Sarah hurried to where Anderson still stood, calmly adjusting his seed sack. "You're either the bravest man I've ever met," she said quietly, "or the biggest fool." Anderson's hands never paused in their work. "There's a third option, Miss Bradley." His voice was soft, meant for her ears alone. "Sometimes a man chooses his ground carefully, knowing exactly what's coming and how to meet it." Young Daniel, who had been watching everything from his perch on the store's porch, suddenly spoke up. "I saw you practice last night, Mr. Anderson. Saw how you move when you think no one's watching." Anderson turned to the boy, something like sadness crossing his features. "And what exactly did you see, Daniel?" "Those weren't farming moves." Daniel's voice dropped to a whisper. "The way your hands move, the way you stand. My Uncle James used to move like that, before the ravens got him." "You're no ordinary farmer." Sarah grabbed her son's shoulder protectively. "What are you really, Mr. Anderson?" Anderson secured his seed sack before answering. "Just a man who learned long ago that there are two ways to deal with predators. You can hunt them, track them, try to kill them one by one, or you can build something they can't destroy, gather good people together, make a stand that matters." He touched the brim of his hat. "Good day, Miss Bradley, Daniel." Sheriff Hayes approached as Anderson walked away, his face grim. "Turner's. Barn is burning," he said without preamble. "Old man Turner tried to stand up to them. He couldn't finish." Sarah's hand went to her throat, where she kept her cousin James's spare badge on a chain. "Robert," she said, using the sheriff's first name for the first time in years, "what are we going to do?" Hayes watched Anderson's retreating figure. "Maybe nothing," he said thoughtfully. "That new farmer of yours, something familiar about him. Way he moves, way he takes in everything. Reminds me of stories I heard during the war. About a scout named Shadow Walker Anderson. They say he could move through enemy lines like a ghost, appear and disappear at will. More importantly, they say he never lost a man under his command. You think our farmer is this Shadow Walker? I think Webb just picked a fight without knowing who he's really fighting. And I think things in Willow Creek Valley are about to get real interesting." As if to punctuate his words, a sound rang out from the western edge of the valley. Not a gunshot, but the clear ring of a hammer striking metal. The sound seemed to hang in the air, a measurement of things to come. The war for Willow Creek Valley was about to begin, though not in the way anyone expected. Not even Webb, with all his reputation for cunning, could have guessed that his greatest enemy would turn out to be a man who seemed to spend more time checking his crops than his weapons. But then, that's what happens when you mistake a scout for prey. Through the valley, the sound of that hammer striking metal carried on the wind a promise and a warning. William Anderson, the farmer who moved like a shadow, had spent months preparing his ground. Now it was time to show Webb and his ravens that some forces can't be broken by fear or fire. They can only be defeated by something stronger than violence, something that grows from seeds planted in courage and watered with patience. The next morning would bring fire to Willow Creek Valley, but it wouldn't be the kind Webb and his ravens were used to setting. It would be the kind that forges strength from adversity, the kind that transforms ordinary farmers into something extraordinary, the kind that proves that sometimes the deadliest weapon isn't the gun in a man's hand, but the strategy in his mind and the conviction in his heart. The day dawned blood-red over Willow Creek Valley, the sun struggling through dust kicked up by riders moving under cover of darkness. Webb's ravens had grown in number overnight, their presence casting long shadows across the morning landscape. Their message couldn't have been clearer: resist and burn. But something else was happening in the valley, something that made even hardened outlaws nervous. It started with the accidents, small things at first. easy to dismiss. Two of Webb's scouts were checking the approaches to Anderson's farm when their horses suddenly spooked, throwing them hard enough to crack ribs. They swore they'd heard nothing, seen nothing, just a flash of metal from the distant rocks that had startled their mounts. Another raven carrying threats to reluctant farmers found his path blocked by falling timber and suspicious rock slides. Each obstacle seemed random, natural even, but they all shared one thing in common. They'd been prepared days in advance, just waiting for the right moment. "Planning on doing some blasting?" Sarah Bradley asked casually that morning, wrapping packages as Anderson made his weekly supply run. His list had changed. Less seed and farming tools, more rope, wire, and oddly specific amounts of mining powder. "Something like that," Anderson replied, his eyes focused on Webb's latest recruits drinking across the street at the Rusty Spur. "Though sometimes the best way to move a boulder isn't to break it, but to make it roll where you want it to go." Before Sarah could respond, Daniel burst into the store, out of breath and wide-eyed. "Mr. Anderson, they're saying Jack Webb is coming, Marcus's younger brother, the one they call the Night Raven. They say he's even deadlier than Marcus." Anderson's reaction was subtle, just a slight tightening around his eyes, but Sarah caught it. "Jack Webb," he said softly. "Now that's interesting timing. Do you know of him?" Sarah asked, though something in Anderson's tone suggested more than mere knowledge. "We've met." Anderson's hand unconsciously touched his left shoulder, where Sarah glimpsed the edge of an old scar through his worn shirt. 2 years ago, down in Kansas. He was terrorizing homesteaders there too, until someone stopped him. Someone. Daniel leaned in, hungry for details. A shadow, they said. A scout who could move through enemy lines like a ghost, strike without being seen. Jack never saw him coming, just heard the explosion of a powder charge that collapsed his hideout. Lost the use of his trigger finger that day and his taste for fair fights. Started sending others to do his killing for him. Sarah's mind was racing, connecting pieces of a puzzle she hadn't even known she was solving. "That's why you chose this valley, isn't it? Why did you spend months preparing your farm? You knew they were coming." Anderson nodded slowly. "Been tracking the Webb brothers for 2 years, watching their pattern. They always move the same way, start with the outer settlements, work their way to the richest water sources. Willow Creek Valley was next on their list. Just had to wait." "Wait. For what?" Daniel asked. "For them to think they had the upper hand, for them to get careless." Anderson gathered his supplies. "Jack Webb is cautious now, won't move unless he thinks he has every advantage. But his brother Marcus, pride makes him take risks, especially when he thinks he's dealing with simple farmers." As if on cue, shouting erupted from the street. 2 of Webb's men were roughing up old man Harrison, whose cattle had mysteriously survived the poisoned well incident. Harrison's son, Timothy, came running to help, only to be pistol-whipped to the ground. Sheriff Hayes emerged from his office, but Webb's other men had him covered. Anderson didn't move, didn't even seem to be watching, but his voice carried an edge Sarah hadn't heard before. "Daniel, remember that cave where you've been watching my farm? The one with the lightning split?" "Oak?" Daniel nodded eagerly. "There's a package there wrapped in oilcloth. Bring it to your mother after dark." "And Daniel," Anderson's eyes locked with the boy's, "don't let anyone see you." As darkness fell, Daniel returned with a heavy bundle. Inside, Sarah found a weapon unlike any she'd seen before, a Spencer carbine, modified with a precision that spoke of a master gunsmith's touch. The rifle was dark as night, its mechanisms smooth as silk. There was also a letter written in Anderson's precise hand S. "Bradley, what's coming isn't just about stopping the Webb brothers. It's about showing good people they can stand against evil, that fear isn't the only way. I've spent months preparing this valley, escape routes, defensive positions, places where one gun can stop 20 men. But a gun's just a tool. What matters is the hands it falls into and the hearts of the people it protects. The sheriff's a good man, but he needs to know he's not standing alone. Show him this rifle, show him there's a plan, and when the time comes, show him there are still people willing to fight for what's right. The next morning, Jack Webb rode into Willow Creek Valley with 8 hardened killers at his back. He was easy to spot, right hand twisted into a useless claw, face carved with hate. His first stop was Anderson's farm, but he found only empty fields and carefully tended rows. No sign of the farmer, though the morning coffee pot was still warm on the stove. Jack didn't like it. Something about the setup felt familiar, tickled old memories he'd rather forget. The precise arrangement of the buildings, the clear lines of sight to every approach. He'd seen work like this before, paid for it with his trigger finger. "Spread out," he ordered his men. "Check every building, every field, find him." That's when the first shot rang out. The bullet didn't kill anyone. Wasn't meant to. Instead, it kicked up dust exactly 1 inch from Jack Webb's boots, spraying his polished leather with Nebraska soil. The message was crystal clear. The next one wouldn't miss. The night raven stood frozen, his crippled hand clutching reflexively at his gun belt as 2 more shots cracked out in rapid succession, each kicking up dirt closer than the last. His men were already diving for cover, but Anderson had spent months preparing this battlefield. Every natural hiding spot had been subtly altered. Boulders that appeared solid were carefully balanced to shift under weight. Clusters of trees had been trimmed to offer less protection than they seemed to promise, and even the innocent-looking irrigation ditches had been dug at angles that would force men to expose themselves to fire. "Scatter!" Jack bellowed. But that's exactly what Anderson had been waiting for. As the riders broke in different directions, more shots rang out, not just from one position, but from multiple points around the farm. Some were simple mechanical tricks, carefully placed rifles with triggers set to tripwires, but each shot was precisely aimed to drive Webb's men exactly where Anderson wanted them. In town, Marcus Webb burst out of the rusty spur at the sound of gunfire, his own men scrambling to mount up. But Sheriff Hayes was waiting in his office doorway, badge gleaming, Anderson's Spencer carbine hanging low on his hip. "Wouldn't do that if I were you," Hayes said calmly. Behind him stood a dozen townspeople, armed and determined. Sarah Bradley's voice rang out from her store's upper window, where she held her own rifle with practiced ease. "You've got enough. Trouble at your brother's position," she called down. "Might want to think carefully about opening a second front." Webb's face darkened with rage. "You really think a few farmers with rusty rifles can stop me? I own 3 valleys north of here, and every man in them knows what happens to those who stand against the Ravens." "You own nothing," came a new voice. Old Man Harrison stepped forward, his face still bruised from yesterday's beating. "You steal, you poison, you murder, but you don't own anything except fear, and we're done being afraid." Back at Anderson's farm, Jack Webb and his remaining men had been herded into a natural basin between 2 rock formations. Every time they tried to break out, precise shots would drive them back, not killing shots, but something more unnerving. Shots that proved the shooter could end them any time he wanted, was choosing not to, just to prove his control. "Show yourself!" Jack screamed, firing wildly at the surrounding rocks, his twisted hand making his aim erratic. "Face me like a man, like you did in Kansas. Like you faced those homesteaders." Anderson's voice carried clearly across the morning air, though no one could spot his position. "Like you faced their families when you burned them out, when you poisoned their wells?" Another shot cracked out, taking Jack's hat clean off his head. The night raven dropped to his knees, his gun falling from trembling fingers. "We can deal," he shouted. "Whatever you want, money, land, name it. What I want," Anderson's voice was closer now, though still hidden, "is for you to carry a message. To every other predator thinking of slithering into this territory, tell them about today. Tell them what happened when you thought you found easy prey and instead found a protector. In town, Marcus Webb was quickly running out of options. More. Townspeople were emerging from their homes, armed and purposeful. He recognized faces. Men and women whose land he'd stolen, whose lives he'd ruined in other valleys. They'd followed the stories here, drawn by word of Anderson's stand, ready to reclaim what was taken. "This is bigger than one valley now," Sheriff Hayes said quietly. "Words spread about what's happening here. Every community you terrorized, every family you drove out, they're all watching, all waiting to see if one town can break the Raven's grip." Webb's hand twitched toward his gun. "Are you really ready to die for this worthless dirt? No one's dying today." The voice rang out clear as a church bell. William Anderson stood in the middle of the street, 30 paces from Webb. No one had seen him move into position, hadn't heard a sound. Like a shadow-given form, the farmer's clothes were dusty from the morning's work, but he stood with a stillness that made every gunman on the street hold their breath. This wasn't the humble farmer who'd spent months tending his crops. This was Shadow Walker Anderson, the army scout who'd moved through enemy lines like a ghost, the man who'd crippled Jack Webb in Kansas, the tactician who'd spent months preparing this exact moment. "No one's dying," Anderson repeated, his voice soft but carrying to every ear, "unless you make it necessary." For the first time, real fear shone in Marcus Webb's eyes. Anderson's stance, his voice, the way his right hand hung relaxed at his side, this was no farmer playing at resistance. This was a predator who had lured his prey exactly where he wanted them. "Last chance," Anderson continued. "Ride out. Leave the territory. Never come back, or find out why they called me Shadow Walker." Webb looked around wildly at the armed townspeople, at his brother's men trapped in the distance, at the mysterious scout who had orchestrated it all. His empire of fear was crumbling, and he knew it. In that moment, Marcus Webb made his final mistake. He drew. What happened next became legend in Willow Creek Valley. Those who saw it swore Anderson never seemed to move, never seemed to aim. There was just the explosion of his revolver and Webb's gun flying from his hand, a perfect shot that left him alive but ended any threat he posed. In the distance, similar shots rang out, disarming the remainder of his men with surgical precision. The war for Willow Creek Valley was over, ending not with a massacre, but with a demonstration of such skill that it left no doubt about what could have happened if Anderson had chosen to kill rather than warn. Daniel Bradley, watching from his mother's store, saw something else in that moment, saw how Anderson's hands moved faster than human eyes could follow. It wasn't just speed, though that was remarkable enough. It was the perfect fusion of mind and muscle, of preparation and execution. Every motion had been planned months in advance, every angle calculated, every possible reaction accounted for. As Webb's men were rounded up, Sarah approached Anderson. "You could have ended this the day you arrived," she said. "Why the wait? What's all the preparation?" Anderson holstered his revolver with the same careful precision he used when planting seeds. "Because some things need to grow," he said, looking out over the valley where his crops were starting to show green. "Take root, become stronger than any one person." As if to prove his point, wagons were already rolling into Willow Creek Valley, families returning, the Turners, the Harrisons, all those who'd been driven out. But they weren't alone. With them came others, drawn by the story of how one small valley had broken the back of the territory's most feared outlaws. Sheriff Hayes found Anderson later that day as the afternoon sun painted the prairie in shades of gold. "Finally remembered where I'd heard about Shadow Walker," he said, settling on Anderson's fence. "Army records from after the war. They say you could have written your own ticket, any marshal's badge, any railroad security job, you name it." Anderson nodded slowly. "They offered good money, important work, but I'd seen enough killing by then, seen what violence does to both sides of any fight. Started thinking maybe the best way to stop evil isn't just to shoot it, but to give good people the courage to stand against it. He gestured at the carefully tended fields, the precise arrangements that had turned a humble farm into a tactical masterpiece. "Farming teaches you patience," Anderson smiled. "Shows you that the most important victories are the ones that take time to grow. I needed Webb to see me as harmless, needed time to prepare the ground, both literally and figuratively. But, more than that, I needed the valley to remember its own strength." Young Daniel Cooper came running up the hill to Anderson's farm one crisp autumn morning, excitement written across his face. They'd found Webb's ledgers in his saddlebags, all the proof of their crimes, every poisoned well, every stolen acre. The territorial judges were riding in to start setting things right. But Anderson's eyes were fixed on the horizon, where the first autumn storms gathered above Blackwood Forest. 6 months had transformed Willow Creek Valley into something few would have recognized in the spring. The returning families brought new energy, new determination. Anderson's farm had become a gathering place, not just for those wanting to learn about agriculture, but for anyone seeking to understand how one man's patient courage had changed everything. "Trouble's brewing south of here," Sheriff Hayes announced, riding up to Anderson's fence line. His new deputy's badge gleamed on his chest, part of the territorial governor's plan to establish proper law enforcement throughout the region. "Word is the Blackwood brothers are moving up from Texas. Makes Webb's gang look like children playing at being outlaws." Anderson continued checking his crops, though Sarah Bradley, watching from nearby, noticed how his movements had changed, becoming more measured, more precise. The farmer was fading, the scout emerging once again. "Tell me about them," he said, examining a wheat stalk with careful attention. 3 brothers, Samuel, John, and William Blackwood. They started in the cattle business, legitimate ranchers until the drought of '65 took everything. Instead of rebuilding, they turned to rustling. But they're smart. Learned that controlling the railroads was more profitable than stealing livestock. Hayes shifted in his saddle. "They've got something Webb never had. Connections in Chicago, money men backing their operations. The kind of men who see our valley's success as a threat to their investments," Sarah added, understanding dawning in her eyes. "If common folks can stand up to men like Webb, then other communities might get similar ideas," Anderson finished, his voice holding that quiet certainty that had come to mean trouble for his enemies. "How many men?" 30 riders at least, all experienced. Former Confederate cavalry, some SA, and they're bringing something new, a Gatling gun. This got Anderson's full attention. The rapid-fire weapon could change everything, make his carefully prepared defensive positions worthless. But there was something in his eyes. Not fear, but the calm calculation that had served him so well before. "You know what most men don't understand about machines like that, Robert?" Anderson asked, examining another wheat stalk with careful attention. "They think more bullets means more power, but a Gatling gun is just like any other weapon. It's only as good as its position, its timing, and the man using it." Sarah approached, her face tight with worry. "Even you can't outshoot a Gatling gun, William." "No," Anderson agreed. "But I don't have to. Sometimes the best way to defeat a weapon isn't to fight it, but to make it useless." He turned to Hayes. "Ride up to the old church ruins behind Mount Calvary. You'll find a cache of supplies I laid in months ago. Bring back the brass spyglass and the mining maps." As Hayes rode off, Sarah confronted Anderson directly. "You knew something like this would happen, didn't you? Even after Webb, you kept preparing." Anderson's smile held no humor. "Peace is like farming, Miss Bradley. You don't just plant once and expect crops forever. You have to tend it, protect it, and be ready for the storms that come." He looked south toward the territory line. "The Blackwoods aren't like Webb. They don't want to own the valley. They want to destroy it, make an example of what happens to those who resist men like them." That evening, Hayes called a town meeting in the church. The community that gathered was different from the frightened settlers of 6 months ago. These were people who had stood against terror and won, who had learned that courage, like fear, could spread if given fertile ground. "The Blackwoods are coming," Hayes announced simply, "and they're coming for blood. That Gatling gun can tear this town apart." "Then we stand again," Old Man Harrison declared, his voice firm. "Anderson showed us how last time." But Anderson, standing quietly at the back of the church, shook his head. "Not like last time. This needs to be different. The Blackwoods are expecting a scout's tricks, expecting me to try to pick off their men from hiding." His eyes held that distant look that meant he was seeing things others couldn't. Sarah watched him sight along a timberline. "You're not building barriers," she realized. "You're building something else." "The Blackwoods think they know what they're facing," Anderson replied quietly. "Think they've learned from Webb's mistakes. But there's an old saying among scouts, the target you see isn't always the target that matters." As the first snow began to fall, Willow Creek Valley prepared for war once again. But this time, under Anderson's guidance, they were preparing for a very different kind of fight. The Shadow Walker had one more lesson to teach about the nature of patience, preparation, and the true meaning of strength. And in the frozen passes to the south, the Blackwood brothers were about to learn why some legends are best left undisturbed. 3 days of snowfall transformed Willow Creek Valley into something otherworldly, a landscape of white, broken only by the dark shapes of Anderson's mysterious constructions. To untrained eyes, they looked like madness, wooden frames and stone piles arranged in patterns that made no obvious sense. But Sarah Cooper had learned to see beyond the obvious where William Anderson was concerned. She found him at dawn, checking measurements with the brass spyglass Hayes had retrieved. The instrument wasn't a military issue. It was something else, something more precise. Like everything about Anderson, it had a purpose beyond the obvious. "That's not just for spotting, is it?" she asked, offering him coffee. Anderson adjusted the spyglass settings with practiced care. "It's a surveyor's. Transit. Spent 2 years with the railroad learning how to map terrain, calculate grades and angles." He smiled slightly. "Useful skills for a scout, even more useful for what's coming." "And what exactly is coming?" The question came from Hayes, approaching. "Through the knee-deep snow. Because right now all I see is a lot of timber and stone placed where it won't stop a single bullet from that Gatling gun." "That's because they're not meant to stop bullets." Anderson's voice held that quiet certainty that had come to mean trouble for his enemies. "They're meant to direct them. Every frame, every stone pile, they're like the banks of a river, channeling water where you want it to go." Understanding dawned in Hayes's eyes. "You're creating killing grounds." "No," Anderson's denial was sharp. "I'm creating choice points, places where the Blackwoods and their men will have to make decisions. And in weather like this, with limited visibility," he gestured at the swirling snow, "they'll make the choices I want them to make." The day brought more preparations, but not the kind anyone expected. Instead of digging defensive positions, Anderson had the townspeople spread hay and straw in specific places, creating paths that looked like natural routes through the snow. Each path led past his wooden constructions, past piles of stone that seemed randomly placed. Daniel, watching from his favorite observation point, began to see the pattern. "It's like a maze," he said excitedly, "but one you can't see until you're in it." "Smart boy," Anderson nodded approvingly. "In a snowstorm, men follow the path of least resistance. They'll take what looks like natural cover, move along the easiest routes. And those routes lead right where you want them," Daniel finished. "But what about the Gatling gun?" Sarah asked, joining them. Anderson's smile held a predator's edge. "A Gatling gun is just a complicated way of throwing lead. And like anything complicated, it has weaknesses: weight, limited mobility in deep snow, fixed firing positions. But its biggest weakness," he pointed to the heavy clouds gathering over the mountains, "visibility. A Gatling gun is useless if you can't see what you're shooting at." That afternoon, the Blackwood scouts were spotted checking the passes. They were careful, professional, but they saw exactly what Anderson wanted them to see. A town preparing typical defenses, seemingly aware of the devastating power of rapid-fire weapons. "Let them look," Anderson instructed when some of the townspeople wanted to drive the scouts off. "Let them think they know what they're facing." Sarah found him that evening in his barn, methodically checking his revolver. But he was also preparing something else, small metal canisters with carefully measured fuses. "Mining charges?" she asked, surprised. "Sometimes," Anderson replied, working the action of his revolver with practiced smoothness. "The best trap isn't the one you set, but the one your enemy sets for himself. Every man has patterns, habits. The Blackwoods are known for using their Gatling gun to pin down their targets while their men move in for the kill. They'll expect us to hunker down, try to weather the storm of bullets. But that's not your plan." Anderson held up one of the metal canisters, studying it in the lamplight. "A scout's greatest asset isn't his stealth, it's his ability to control the battlefield, to shape it, to know every angle, every distance, every choice his opponent will face." As night fell, more news arrived. The Blackwoods' main force was moving through the passes, using the storm for cover. They had the Gatling gun hauled on a specially designed sled, but they also had something else, something that made Anderson's eyes narrow when he heard about it. "Explosive shells," Daniel reported breathlessly. "For the Gatling gun. They're saying Samuel Blackwood plans to make an example of Willow Creek Valley, not just defeat us, destroy us completely." Anderson absorbed this information with his usual calm. But those who knew him saw the subtle changes, the way he checked his gear with extra care, the stillness that came over him. Not the stillness of fear, but of a tactician preparing to strike. "Good," he said finally, surprising everyone. "Let them bring their explosives. Sometimes the best weapon is the one your enemy brings to the fight." That night, as the storm intensified, Anderson gathered the town's defenders in the church. The plan he laid out was unlike anything they expected. No heroic last stands, no dramatic gunfights from distant ridges. Instead, he spoke of timing, of pressure points, of how fear and limited visibility could turn a superior force's strength against itself. Tomorrow, he concluded, the Blackwoods will learn what Webb learned, that Willow Creek Valley isn't just land worth fighting for, it's land worth thinking for, ground worth planning for, and most importantly, his eyes met. Each defender in turn, it's home to people worth protecting by any means necessary. As the defenders dispersed to their positions, Sarah caught Anderson's arm. "You're not telling us everything, are you? There's more to your plan." "There always is, Miss Bradley." Anderson checked the chambers of his revolver one final time. "But sometimes the best plan is the one your own people can't reveal, even under pressure." The night deepened, the storm howling like a pack of wolves scenting blood. Somewhere in that swirling white darkness, the Blackwoods forces were moving into position, confident in their superior firepower and explosive arsenal. But they were moving into a battlefield shaped by a master of angles and distances, a man who had spent months preparing for this moment. "The next part of our story," Anderson told Daniel as they made final preparations, "will reveal just how deep a scout's planning can go, and how one man's patient genius could turn even the most powerful weapons against those who wielded them." Through the night, Anderson moved like his old namesake, a shadow in the storm, making final adjustments to his preparations. Each wooden frame, each pile of stone, each scattered bit of hay had its purpose in a plan so subtle that even those implementing it couldn't see its full scope. Dawn never really came to Willow Creek Valley that morning, just a gradual lightening of the storm's darkness to a ghostly gray. The snow fell in thick curtains, reducing visibility to mere yards, transforming familiar shapes into looming shadows. Perfect weather for an attack, most would say, But Anderson had been counting on exactly this kind of day. The first sign of the Blackwood's advance came as a deep rumbling through the frozen ground, the sound of heavy sleds carrying the Gatling gun through the swirling snow. Dark figures emerged, moving exactly as Anderson had predicted, following the paths of least resistance that he'd so carefully prepared. "Right on schedule," Anderson murmured from his position near the church steeple. He wasn't using his spyglass in this weather. Eyes alone worked better. Besides, he'd memorized every distance, every angle months ago. "Jamie, signal the North Ridge," Anderson called softly to young Daniel. The boy raised a lantern 3 times, its light diffused by the snow into an ethereal glow. Moments later, an answering flash came from where Harrison and his men waited. Everything was in position. The Blackwood's men moved with military precision, securing what looked like advantageous positions among Anderson's wooden constructions. The Gatling gun was placed exactly where any cavalry commander would put it, on a slight rise, offering clear fields of fire toward the town, or what seemed like clear fields. "They're loading the explosive shells," Daniel reported, watching through the brass spyglass. "4 men to each ammunition box, just like you said they would," Anderson nodded, checking his weathered Remington one last time. "Confident men make predictable choices. Samuel Blackwood thinks he's learned from Webb's mistakes, thinks overwhelming firepower is the answer to a skilled scout." The attack began with theatrical flourish. Samuel Blackwood himself rode forward through the snow, his cavalry officer's coat stark against the white landscape. His voice boomed across the valley, practiced and imperious. "To the people of Willow Creek Valley, you've earned a reputation for defiance, for harboring a man who thinks himself clever enough to stand against progress. Today, you'll learn the cost of such pride." As if to punctuate his words, the Gatling gun opened fire, its savage drumbeat echoing off the hills. Hundreds of explosive shells chewed through the snow, detonating against wood and stone. But Anderson's careful preparations proved their worth. Most of the explosions were caught by hidden earthworks or deflected by precisely angled timber frames. "Time to introduce some variables," Anderson said calmly. He fired a single shot, not at any person, but at a specific stone pile on the valley's eastern edge. The impact dislodged a carefully balanced rock, which tumbled down, triggering a cascade. The resulting avalanche wasn't large, but it didn't need to be. The thundering snow and rock sent Blackwood's men scrambling for new cover, exactly the positions Anderson had prepared for them. "They're splitting up," Daniel observed, "just like you said they would." Anderson was already moving, ghost-like, through the storm. "Fear makes men predictable. When faced with danger from above, they'll seek solid cover below." Sheriff Hayes's voice crackled through the wind. "Ready when you are." The next phase began with another single shot from Anderson, this one striking a concealed cache of mining charges near the Gatling gun position. The explosion wasn't large, but in the swirling snow it seemed massive. More importantly, it sprayed frozen debris across the snow, creating a wall of ice crystals that further reduced visibility. Blackwood's men, already nervous, began firing wildly at shadows. The Gatling gun roared again, but in the chaos and limited visibility, their explosive shells might as well have been fireworks, all sound and fury, signifying nothing. Meanwhile, Anderson's carefully placed townspeople began their part, firing from multiple positions, creating the illusion of a much larger force. "You're using their own weapons against them," Sarah realized, watching from the church tower. The snow, the explosives, even the terror of the Gatling gun. Every weapon has 2 edges. "A Gatling gun is fearsome when you can see your target," Anderson replied, moving to a new position with fluid grace. "In a snowstorm, with careful preparation," he gestured at the chaos below, "it becomes a source of fear for those using it." Battle reached its crescendo as Blackwood's ammunition teams, desperate to resupply their guns, found themselves caught in Anderson's invisible maze. Paths that seemed to lead to the guns actually circled back, bringing them under fire from their own explosive shells. Through it all, Anderson moved like his old namesake, a ghost in the storm, appearing and disappearing, each shot precise and purposeful. He never aimed to kill, but each bullet drove Blackwood's men exactly where he wanted them. The turning point came when one of the Gatling gun crews, thoroughly lost and panicked, sought shelter in what appeared to be a stable. Too late, they realized it was one of Anderson's carefully prepared positions, and they had just trapped themselves with their own explosive shells. "Surrender now!" Anderson's voice carried through the storm, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. "You're surrounded, your weapons are useless, and that stable you're hiding in, the support beam above your heads, is rigged to collapse. One shot is all it would take." Samuel Blackwood's rage cut through the howling wind. "Show yourself, you coward. Face me like a soldier." "Soldier?" Anderson's voice held something cold. "Men like you understand only one thing: power. So I'm showing you a different kind of power. Not the power to destroy, but the power to control. Every move you've made since entering this valley has been exactly what I wanted. Every position you've taken, every shell you've fired, all part of a plan months in the making." As if to prove his point, another series of controlled avalanches cut off Blackwood's escape routes. His men were now completely boxed in, caught in a trap so subtle they hadn't even realized it was closing until too late. The end, when it came, was surprisingly quiet. No dramatic final shootout, no heroic charges, just the gradual realization by Blackwood's men that they were utterly outmaneuvered, caught in a web of somebody else's design. But Anderson wasn't done. He had one final lesson to teach about. The true nature of power and justice, a lesson that would ensure Willow Creek Valley's peace for generations to come. "You have a choice," Anderson said, his voice carrying across the pristine morning air, "one that's more generous than you offered others." He stood before Blackwood, his revolver holstered but ready. "You can face territorial justice for your crimes. And believe me, we have enough witnesses now to ensure that happens, or you can become something more valuable, a messenger." Blackwood, his cavalry coat now stained white with snow and defeat, sneered. "A messenger of what?" "Of consequence," Anderson replied simply. "The truth about what really happened here. Not just about how one scout outmaneuvered your entire force, but about how one community stood together and proved that all your fancy weapons, all your explosive shells, mean nothing against people who know how to think, how to prepare, how to stand their ground." Sarah, watching from nearby, saw something she'd never expected. Anderson was offering not just mercy, but purpose. He wasn't just ending a fight. He was transforming an enemy into a tool for peace. "Why should I carry your message?" Blackwood demanded, though there was something different in his voice now, something almost like respect. "Because you're a student of power," Anderson answered. "You've built your reputation on understanding strength. So tell me, what's more powerful? The fact that I could have killed you and your men a dozen times over, or the fact that I chose not to? Your Gatling gun that now lies useless in the snow, or the strategy that made it worthless?" He gestured at the valley around them, at the intricate network of preparations that had turned a superior force's strength against itself. "You came here expecting to find one scout, one man to defeat. Instead, you found an entire community that had learned to think like a scout, to use patience, preparation, and precision instead of brute force." As if to emphasize his point, the townspeople were already emerging, not with vengeful anger, but with the quiet confidence of those who had learned their own strength. They began dismantling Anderson's elaborate constructions, repurposing the materials for rebuilding and growth. "Your reputation will actually help spread the message," Anderson continued. "When the notorious Samuel Blackwood tells others about How his Gatling gun and explosive shells were defeated not by superior firepower, but by superior thinking. Well, that's the kind of story that makes men stop and reconsider their choices. Daniel, now standing proudly beside his mother, understood what Anderson was doing. You're not just protecting Willow Creek Valley anymore, are you? You're teaching others how to protect themselves. Anderson smiled at the boy's insight. The best victory isn't the one that leaves your enemy destroyed, but transformed, changed in a way that helps others change too. In the days that followed, Blackwood did indeed become a messenger, though not in the way anyone expected. He stayed in Willow Creek Valley, not as a prisoner but as a student. Anderson taught him not just about tactics and strategy, but about the deeper principles that had transformed a simple valley into something extraordinary. Power isn't just about who has the biggest guns, Anderson explained one evening as they surveyed the valley from his porch. It's about understanding the terrain, both the physical landscape and the landscape of human nature. It's about knowing when to shoot and when to grow something instead. The spring that followed brought more than just new crops to Willow Creek Valley. It brought visitors, lawmen, community leaders, and yes, even reformed outlaws, all coming to learn from the place where one of the territory's most feared forces had been defeated not by violence but by patience and preparation. Anderson's farm became a different kind of school, though not one that taught traditional subjects. He taught principles, how to read terrain, how to prepare ground, how to build community defenses that didn't rely solely on guns. But most importantly, he taught people how to think like protectors rather than predators. Sarah, watching all this unfold, finally asked him the question that had been on her mind since the beginning. You never intended to just save one valley, did you? Anderson looked out over his flourishing fields, where wheat grew in patterns that could still serve as defensive positions if needed, but now primarily yielded bread for a growing community. During the war, he said quietly, I learned that a scout's greatest skill isn't stealth. It's the ability to see patterns, to understand how small changes can have large effects. I realized the same principle could be applied to fighting evil. Sometimes the best way to stop violence isn't with more violence, but by teaching people how to make violence ineffective. As spring painted Willow Creek Valley in shades of green and gold, word of what had happened there spread across the territory like wildfire in dry grass. The story grew with each telling, how the legendary Shadow Walker had turned a simple farm into an invisible fortress, how he'd defeated a Gatling gun with nothing but patience and planning, how he'd transformed one of the territory's most notorious cavalry officers into a teacher of peace. But change, like the prairie flowers that bloomed after rain, often draws unexpected attention. The morning trouble rode back into the valley and started peacefully enough. Anderson was teaching Daniel the finer points of reading terrain, how to spot natural defensive positions, how to understand the way wind and weather could work for or against you. When Sheriff Hayes rode up fast, kicking up dust from the newly thawed ground. "Riders coming," he announced without preamble, "but not the usual sort. Army officers, look like Colonel James Whitfield, and a full company of cavalry." Anderson's reaction was subtle, just a slight pause in his movements. But Sarah caught it. "You know them? Know of them," Anderson replied, his voice carrying that careful neutrality that meant trouble. "Whitfield was at Fort Kearny during the war. Man who believes that peace comes only from having the biggest guns and the most men to use them." "Why would the Army take interest in us now?" Daniel asked, eager to apply his newly learned skills of reading situations. Anderson smiled grimly. "Because, son, we've done something more dangerous than beating a few outlaws. We've shown there's another way to handle trouble. Some folks find that more threatening than any gunfighter." Colonel James Whitfield rode into town like he owned it, straight-backed on a gleaming bay stallion, 50 cavalrymen at his back. His uniform was parade ground perfect, brass buttons catching the morning sun. But it was his eyes that Sarah noticed. cold and calculating, measuring everything in terms of military advantage. "Quite the operation you've got here," Whitfield announced, surveying the valley from his saddle. "Word of what happened with the Blackwood gang has reached all the way to Washington. They're very interested in how one farmer managed to defeat a Gatling gun." He spoke the word farmer like it tasted bitter. Anderson, standing on his porch, simply nodded in greeting, every bit the humble agriculturist. "No mystery to it, Colonel. Good people working together, knowing their land. Nothing that would interest Washington." Whitfield's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, but it does interest them, Mr. Anderson. Or should I say, Shadow Walker. The Army's been looking for you for quite some time. Your skills could be put to better use than growing." Wheat! The tension in the air thickened like storm clouds gathering. Sarah saw how Anderson's hand stayed carefully away from his holstered revolver, how he maintained his relaxed posture, even as his eyes marked every soldier's position. "I appreciate the offer," Anderson said, his voice still calm as summer rain. "But my fighting days are done. These days, I prefer to grow things." "This isn't an offer, Shadow Walker. This is a requisition of valuable military assets. You, your tactical knowledge, and these fascinating defensive arrangements you've created. The Army needs men who can train others in these techniques." Anderson's smile remained pleasant, but something shifted in his stance, subtle, almost invisible. "Seems to me," he replied carefully, "that a man's skills belong to himself, just like a farmer's crops belong to those who planted them." Whitfield's face hardened. "These are uncertain times, Anderson. The territory needs order, structure. We can't have every settlement taking the law into their own hands, creating their own militias. It sets a dangerous precedent, more dangerous than leaving good people helpless against predators." Anderson's question hung in the air like gunsmoke. "The Army can handle any threats to legitimate settlements." Whitfield's voice carried the weight of official authority. "We're establishing a new fort just south of here. All local defense matters will be handled through proper military channels." Anderson studied the colonel for a long moment, then did something unexpected. He chuckled. "You still don't understand what really happened here, do you? This was never about fighting. It was about teaching people they don't need to live in fear, that with proper preparation and community spirit, they can protect themselves. That's exactly the kind of dangerous thinking we're here to address." Whitfield's hand rested meaningfully on his cavalry saber. "The Army cannot allow civilians to establish their own power structures outside proper authority." Power structures? Anderson's voice held genuine amusement now. "Colonel, all we've done here is show people how to farm smart, how to work together, how to use what they have to protect what they love. If that threatens your authority, maybe you should question what kind of authority you're really defending." The confrontation was interrupted by the arrival of more riders, but these weren't soldiers. They were farmers, ranchers, townspeople from settlements all across the territory. At their head rode Samuel Blackwood himself, transformed from the terror of the territory into something else entirely. "Heard there might be trouble brewing," Blackwood announced, dismounting easily. "Thought we'd come see if our teacher needed any help with his lesson." Whitfield's face darkened as more riders appeared on every ridge surrounding the valley. These weren't armed gangs or military units. They were ordinary people carrying tools more often than guns, but moving with the same quiet confidence Anderson had taught them. "What is this?" Whitfield demanded. "This," Anderson replied softly, "is what real peace looks like, Colonel. Not enforced by guns or uniforms, but grown from the ground up. Every person here has learned that the strongest weapon isn't the one that kills best, but the one that protects most effectively." He gestured at his fields, where wheat grew in patterns that could serve as defensive positions, but primarily yielded bread. "You see a dangerous precedent. I see hope taking root. You see power slipping away. I see it flowing to where it truly belongs, in the hands of good people who know how to use it wisely." Sarah stepped forward, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet valley. When the Webb gang came, we were helpless. When the Blackwoods came with their Gatling gun, we were ready, not because we had bigger guns or more fighters, but because William taught us something more valuable than shooting. He taught us how to think, how to prepare, how to stand together. Whitfield looked around at the gathering crowd, at the determined faces of people who had learned to protect themselves without losing their humanity. For the first time, uncertainty showed in his expression. Washington won't like this, he warned. They'll see it as a threat to established order. Then maybe, Anderson suggested quietly, you should tell them a different story. Not about a gunfighter teaching people to fight, but about communities learning to prevent violence before it starts. About a new kind of peace, one that doesn't need forts or cavalry to maintain it. Samuel Blackwood stepped forward, his cavalry training evident in his bearing. Colonel, I used to think like you, that power came from the barrel of a gun, that peace had to be enforced from above. But Anderson showed me something different. He showed me that true strength comes from the ground up, from people working together, from communities that know how to protect themselves without becoming what they're fighting against. Daniel, who had been watching everything with keen eyes, suddenly spoke up. Mr. Anderson says the best defense isn't a fort or a gun. It's neighbors who'll stand with you, fields that feed you, and the knowledge to use both wisely. Whitfield dismounted slowly, the movement precise as any cavalry officer's. He walked toward Anderson's porch, his eyes taking in the subtle details he'd missed before, how the farm's layout provided clear lines of sight in all directions, how the seemingly random placement of buildings and fences could channel movement, how even the crop rows could serve as natural defensive positions. You've created something remarkable here, he finally admitted. But it's more dangerous than you realize. If every settlement learned these methods, then the territory would have fewer problems for the army to solve. Anderson finished. Think about it, Colonel. How much manpower do you waste chasing outlaws? How many soldiers' lives are at risk dealing with threats that communities could handle themselves if they knew how? Sarah noticed something change in Whitfield's expression, the first crack in his military facade. You're suggesting we work together. I'm suggesting there's a middle ground between military control and chaos. Look at what happened here with the Blackwoods. We didn't just defeat them, we transformed them. Their knowledge, their skills are now being used to protect, rather than destroy. Blackwood nodded. My men and I know every trick outlaws use because we use them ourselves. Now we teach communities how to counter those tricks and how to make themselves less attractive targets. And that's what really frightens your superiors. Isn't it, Colonel? Anderson's voice was gentle now. Not that we're teaching people to fight, but that we're teaching them to think, to solve problems without waiting for official solutions. More riders were arriving. Merchants who had learned new trade routes, ranchers who had discovered strength in cooperation, even a few former outlaws who had found purpose in protecting rather than preying on others. Each brought their own skills, their own knowledge, all shaped by Anderson's patient teaching. What exactly are you proposing? Whitfield asked, his military training warring with his growing understanding. A partnership, Anderson replied. The army maintains order on the large scale, while communities learn to handle local threats. Your soldiers train with our people, learning how to work with civilians instead of just protecting them. In return, we share what we've learned about making peace sustainable. Washington sent me to shut this down, Whitfield admitted. But maybe... He looked around at the gathered people, at the evident strength of their community. Maybe there's a better story to tell. Not about civilians defying authority, but about a new model of cooperation between the military and the people they're sworn to protect. Now you're thinking like a true leader, Anderson smiled. Someone who understands that real authority doesn't come from controlling people, but from helping them grow stronger. The discussion continued into the evening. moving from Anderson's porch to the church, where the community had faced so many challenges before. Maps were spread out, plans discussed, new possibilities explored. Whitfield's military expertise combined with Anderson's tactical insights and the community's practical experience, created something none of them had imagined before. "We could establish training centers," Blackwood suggested, "not just for fighting, but for all aspects of community defense, farming methods that support security, construction techniques that incorporate protection, trade networks that strengthen cooperation." "The Army could provide structure and resources," Whitfield added, warming to the idea, "while local communities maintain their independence and unique approaches." Sarah watched Anderson during these discussions, noting how he guided the conversation without dominating it, how he helped others discover solutions rather than imposing them. This, she realized, was his true gift, not his skill with a gun or his tactical genius, but his ability to help people find their own strength. As the meeting concluded, Whitfield approached Anderson privately. "You know, some in the Army won't. Like this, they'll see it as surrendering control. Then help them see it differently," Anderson replied. "Show them how much stronger the territory becomes when every community knows how to stand on its own. How much more effective the Army can be when it works with people instead of just protecting them." "You're not just changing how we handle defense," Whitfield realized. "You're changing how people think about power itself." Anderson nodded. "The strongest fence isn't the one that stands alone, Colonel. It's the one supported by many posts, each doing its part. The same is true for peace." As word of this new approach spread across the territory, something unexpected began to happen. Communities that had once competed began cooperating, sharing resources and knowledge. Trade routes became more secure, not through military presence, but through connected settlements, watching out for each other. Even the Army found its role evolving, becoming partners in peace, rather than just its enforcers. The first snow of winter fell early that year, blanketing Willow Creek Valley in pristine white. Anderson stood on his porch, studying the horizon with the brass spyglass that had served him so well. But he wasn't watching for threats this time. He was observing the new watchtowers rising along the territory's main trade routes, a visible sign of the changed relationship between military and civilian forces. "Rider coming," Daniel called. From his lookout post, the boy's voice carrying clear in the crisp morning air, "moving fast from the south." The messenger was one of Whitfield's men, his cavalry uniform dusted with snow and trail grime. He dismounted at Anderson's fence, his expression grave. "Shadow Walker, we've got trouble brewing, big trouble." "What kind?" Anderson asked, though something in his eyes suggested he already knew. "Railroads pushing a new line through the territory. Their hired guns have been pressuring settlements along the proposed route, forcing people to sell their land for pennies. But that's not the worst of it." The soldier paused, catching his breath. "They've recruited Jack Webb." Sarah, who had approached to hear the news, felt her blood run cold. Jack Webb, Marcus's younger brother, had escaped during the Ravens' last stand. Unlike his brother, who'd faced justice, Jack had disappeared into the lawless territories to the south. "Tell me," Anderson said quietly. "He's put together a new gang calling themselves the Iron Riders. They're working as security for the railroad, but really they're just strong-arming folks off their land. They've got military weapons, dynamite, even a few Gatling guns they claim are for protecting construction crews." Anderson's eyes narrowed slightly. "The railroad's giving them legal cover." "Exactly. Colonel Whitfield's hands are tied. Can't move against them officially without proof they're breaking the law, and they're being careful about that. Every burned-out farm, every poisoned well, every accident, they make sure it can't be traced back to them. How many settlements have they hit? 3 so far, Pine Ridge, Copper Creek, and Miller's Junction. Each time it's the same. Mysterious accidents start happening. People get scared. The railroad offers to buy them out for their own safety. Those who refuse. The soldier shook his head grimly. Sarah saw the change come over Anderson. Subtle but unmistakable. The farmer's calm was replaced by the scout's focused intensity. This isn't just about land, is it? No, ma'am. Webb's using the railroad's push to settle old scores. Word is, he's been asking about Willow Creek Valley, about the man who taught farmers to fight back. Anderson was silent for a long moment, his eyes distant as he thought through implications. Jack Webb's smart, he said finally. Smarter than his brother in some ways. He's learned from past mistakes, found a way to make his violence look legitimate. What are we going to do? Daniel asked, his young face serious. We're going to do what we've always done, Anderson replied. Prepare the ground, but this time it's different. We're not just defending one valley, we're helping others learn to defend themselves. Over the next few days, riders spread out from Willow Creek Valley, carrying messages to all the settlements that had learned Anderson's methods. Samuel Blackwood, now a trusted ally, led a group south to warn communities along the railroad's projected route. But they didn't just carry warnings. They carried knowledge, seeds of resistance that could take root in fertile ground. The railroad's counting on isolation, Anderson explained during a community meeting in the church. They pick off settlements, one by one, using fear and accidents to break people's will. But we've built something stronger than fear. We've built connections. Sarah watched as he laid out maps showing the territory's trade routes, water sources, and defensive positions. Look here, Anderson pointed to specific locations. Every settlement we've taught has its own strengths. Pine Ridge has high ground perfect for observation. Copper Creek controls key water sources. Miller's Junction sits at a natural choke. You point for rail construction. But they've got Gatling guns, someone objected, and the law on their side. Anderson's smile held that quiet confidence that had seen them through so many challenges. Gatling guns don't work so well when their firing positions are compromised. Rail lines don't lay so smooth when the ground's been prepared against them. And the law, he glanced at Sheriff Hayes, works both ways when you know how to use it. Whitfield, who had ridden in for the meeting, cleared his throat. The Army's position is complicated. We can't directly interfere with legitimate railroad construction. No, Anderson agreed, but you can enforce existing laws about water rights, land claims, and the use of military weapons by civilian contractors. Every time Webb's men have to explain themselves to official investigators, it slows them down, makes them careful. And while they're being careful, Blackwood added, understanding dawning in his eyes, we're helping settlements prepare, not just physically but legally. Property records, water rights documentation, witness statements about threats and accidents. Exactly. Anderson turned to the gathered community. Webb thinks he's learned from his brother's mistakes, thinks having the railroad's money and lawyers behind him makes him untouchable. But he's forgotten the most important lesson from last time, the strength of people working together. The plan that emerged over the next few days was unlike anything they'd attempted before. It wasn't just about defending one area or defeating one enemy. It was about creating a network of resistance so subtle and legally sound that even the railroad's lawyers couldn't break it. Every settlement becomes a link in the chain, Anderson explained, marking positions on the maps. Each one prepared not just to defend itself, but to support its neighbors. When Webb's men pressure one community, they find themselves dealing with problems in 3 others. When they try to force a land sale in one place, they discover their construction materials mysteriously delayed in another. Sarah watched him work, noting how he applied the same precise attention to legal documents that he once used for setting trap lines. You're not just teaching people to fight back, she realized. You're teaching them to fight smart, to use the railroad's own methods against it. The best defense, Anderson replied, checking another property deed, isn't always the most obvious. Webb and his Iron Riders expect resistance. They're prepared for that. What they don't expect is to find every settlement along their route suddenly discovering ancient water rights, filing mining claims, documenting old trails and grazing. Lands that just happened to cross their planned rail line. As winter deepened, Anderson's strategy began to take shape. Riders moved constantly between settlements, carrying not just warnings, but knowledge, legal documents, survey maps, witness statements. Every community became a storage point for evidence that could be used against the railroad's strong-arm tactics. But Anderson knew that paper defenses alone wouldn't be enough. In the barn loft that evening, he checked his old Spencer carbine while teaching Daniel the finer points of observation. Remember, he told the boy, the most important targets aren't always the most obvious. Webb's men will be watching for armed resistance, expecting the kind of tricks we used before. But sometimes the best way to stop a man with a gun isn't to outshoot him. It's to make him question whether pulling the trigger is worth the trouble it'll bring. Dawn painted the Nebraska sky in shades of winter gold when the first report of the Iron Riders' advance reached Willow Creek Valley. They'd struck Miller's Junction in the night, but something was different this time. Instead of the usual pattern of threats and accidents, they'd found themselves tangled in unexpected complications. You should have seen it, Samuel Blackwood reported, snow still melting from his coat as he warmed himself by Anderson's fire. Webb's men rode in expecting to find scared farmers. Instead, they found themselves facing a town council meeting with 3 territorial surveyors and a federal land office representative, all there to document mysterious incidents affecting interstate commerce. Anderson smiled slightly, checking. The latest batch of maps spread across his table. How did Webb handle that? Not well. Blackwood's grin held genuine amusement, especially when he discovered that every piece of accidentally damaged property had been officially appraised the day before. His railroad lawyers spent hours trying to explain why they weren't responsible, while more evidence kept appearing. Sarah Bradley, who'd been teaching other settlements her method of documenting threats and property damage, leaned forward. What about the Gatling guns? That's the beautiful part. Every time they tried to move them into position, they discovered the ground wouldn't support the weight. Seems someone had been teaching folks about how winter frost can make apparently solid ground unstable. Blackwood's eyes met Anderson's. Amazing how nature works sometimes. The winter wind carried more than just snow across the territory. It carried stories of how small settlements were standing up to the railroad's pressure. Each community used methods tailored to its particular strengths, all guided by Anderson's patient teaching. Pine Ridge's high observation posts always seemed to spot Webb's men coming, giving other settlements time to prepare. Copper Creek's control of water sources meant construction crews frequently found their work disrupted by natural flooding. And at every turn, official witnesses and surveyors appeared to document everything. "You're building a legal trap," Colonel Whitfield observed, studying the growing pile of evidence in Anderson's barn. Every move Webb makes gets tangled in more documentation. The railroad chose this battlefield when they decided to use the law as a weapon, Anderson replied, sorting through witness statements. But they forgot something important about the law. It works best for those who know how to prepare their ground. Daniel, who'd been learning to analyze patterns in the Iron Riders' movements, suddenly burst into the barn. "Mr. Anderson, new telegram from Echo Canyon. The railroad's bringing in more men, but they're not gunfighters this time. They're surveyors and legal teams." Good. Anderson's response surprised everyone. That means they're starting to understand the real fight. "How is that good?" Sarah asked. "Won't more lawyers just make things harder?" "Lawyers and surveyors cost money," Anderson explained. A lot more than hired guns. Every day the railroad has to spend fighting legal battles and redoing surveys is a day they're not laying track. Time works in our favor, but Jack Webb wasn't a man to accept defeat easily. His next move proved he'd learned more from his previous encounters with Anderson than anyone suspected. The Iron Riders began targeting the network itself, disrupting communication between settlements, intercepting riders, trying to isolate communities. He's trying to break the connections, Anderson mused, marking reported incidents on his maps. Smart, but he's forgotten something about roots. The deeper they go, the harder they are to break. The next phase of Anderson's strategy revealed itself gradually. Settlements began using multiple redundant methods of communication. Signal, fires, relay riders, even coded messages passed through regular trade caravans. When Webb's men disrupted one route, 3 others carried the word through. But it's more than just messages, Anderson explained to Daniel during one of their observation lessons. Watch how the trade wagons move now. The boy studied the patterns of movement visible from their hillside vantage point. They're not taking the direct routes anymore. They're zigzagging between settlements. Each stop strengthens the connections, Anderson nodded approvingly, makes it harder for Webb to isolate any one community. But more importantly, every wagon carries something more valuable than goods. Information, Daniel realized. About the railroad's movements, about Webb's men, about which legal strategies are working best. The Iron Riders' frustration showed in increasingly desperate actions. They tried burning out key trading posts, only to discover that vital supplies and documents had been dispersed among multiple locations. They attempted to intimidate territorial officials, only to find themselves facing investigations from federal authorities who'd been quietly documenting their activities. One cold morning, Anderson stood with Sarah on his porch watching new riders arrive from distant settlements. Each brought more pieces of the growing resistance, legal documents, survey challenges, witness statements. But they also brought something else, hope. Look at them, Sarah said softly. A year ago, these people would have been hiding from men like Webb. Now they're standing together, fighting back with something stronger than guns. Knowledge, Anderson agreed. The kind that grows and spreads. Webb can burn a farm, but he can't burn an idea. He can threaten a person, but he can't threaten a community that knows its own strength. The turning point came unexpectedly, not in a dramatic confrontation, but in a quiet meeting at the territorial capital. Railroad executives, faced with mounting delays and legal challenges, began questioning the cost of their strong-arm tactics. Every settlement they pressure now costs them 10 times what they expected, Whitfield reported, having witnessed the meeting. Their shareholders are asking uncomfortable questions about why a simple rail line is taking so long and costing so much. The railroad's beginning to learn what Webb never understood, Anderson said, making another mark on his map. True strength isn't about having the most power, it's about knowing how to use what you have wisely. But Jack Webb had one more card to play, one that would test everything Anderson had built. The Iron Riders began gathering in force, not to attack settlements directly, but to target something more fundamental. The winter food supplies that connected communities had carefully stored. He's going for the roots, Anderson realized, studying reports of Webb's movements. Trying to force settlements to choose between resistance and survival. The move revealed both Webb's cunning and his desperation. He knew that communities might stand firm against direct threats, but hunger could break even the strongest resolve. What he didn't know was that Anderson had been preparing for this possibility since the first harvest. Remember how we taught people to store their supplies? He asked Sarah, pulling out a different set of maps. Not just in barns and silos, but in hidden caches throughout their territories. Sarah's eyes widened as she understood. The same way you prepared defensive positions, scattered, redundant, each supporting the others. Webb thinks he can starve people into submission, Anderson nodded, but he's about to learn another lesson about how deep our preparations go. The next phase of the conflict would require all the skills Anderson had taught, not just tactics and preparation, but the deeper wisdom of knowing when to stand firm and when to appear to bend. The winter war for the territory's future was about to enter its most crucial phase, testing not just the strength of individual communities, but the bonds that connected them. As news of Webb's plan to target food supplies spread, something remarkable began to happen. Communities that had been competing for resources just a year ago now coordinated their responses with practiced efficiency. Each settlement activated emergency protocols Anderson had helped them develop during quieter times. Like a spider's web, Daniel observed from his lookout post, watching supply wagons move under cover of darkness. Touch one strand, and the whole web feels it. Anderson nodded approvingly at his young student's insight. Webb thinks he's attacking our weakest point. Instead, he's triggered our strongest response. The plan revealed itself in layers, each more intricate than the last. Hidden caches weren't just scattered randomly, they were positioned to support multiple communities. If the Iron Riders threatened one settlement's supplies, 3 others could provide support without compromising their own security. But it's more than just food, Sarah realized, watching Anderson mark new positions on his maps. You've turned their attack into an opportunity. Webb's men have to expose themselves to target the supplies, Anderson explained. Every move they make gets documented, witnessed, recorded. The railroad's lawyers can't claim accidents or unknown parties when we have sworn statements from federal agents witnessing their men's actions. Colonel Whitfield, arriving with new reports from the territorial capital, understood the strategy's deeper implications. You're not just protecting supplies. You're building a legal case that even the railroad's money can't bury. Anderson's eyes held that distant look that meant he was seeing patterns others might miss. The railroad chose this fight because they thought they could use the law as a weapon. Now that same law is becoming a trap. The Iron Riders' frustration showed in increasingly reckless actions. They tried burning storage barns only to find them empty, the supplies having been moved days before based on Anderson's predicted patterns of attack. They attempted to blockade trade routes, only to discover that communities had multiple alternate paths of communication and support. But why not just shoot them? One of the younger settlers asked during a strategy meeting. We've got the numbers now, the positions. Anderson's response carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. Because this isn't about who can kill better, it's about showing there's a stronger way to fight. Every time Webb's men attack a barn and find it empty, every time they threaten a community and find it supported by 5 others, they're learning that their old methods don't work anymore. The winter deepened, and with it came the true test of Anderson's strategy. The Iron Riders, desperate to break the settlement's resistance, launched a coordinated attack on multiple storage locations. But what they found changed everything. They rode into Miller's Junction at midnight, Blackwood reported, his voice carrying a note of triumph. Torches ready, expecting to find the winter stores. Instead, they found 20 federal marshals documenting their attempt to destroy interstate commerce supplies. Similar scenes played out across the territory. Every major action by Webb's men had been predicted, prepared for, and turned into evidence. The railroad's lawyers, already struggling to explain mounting delays and costs, now faced federal investigations into their security contractors. The smartest trap, Anderson told Daniel during one of their observation sessions, is the one your enemy doesn't realize is a trap until he's already caught. Webb thought he was fighting farmers and settlers. Instead, he was fighting an idea. The idea that communities working together are stronger than any force trying to tear them apart. But the true victory wasn't in the legal documents or the protected supplies. It was in the change that came over the territory's people. They no longer saw themselves as isolated homesteaders fighting alone against powerful forces. They had become something more, a network of communities that knew how to support each other, how to use the law as effectively as any rifle, how to turn their opponent's strength against them. The breaking point came not with gunfire or violence, but with a telegram that arrived at the territorial capital on a bitter February morning. The railroad's board of directors, faced with mounting evidence and federal investigations, had made their decision. The Iron Riders' contract was terminated, effective immediately. Jack Webb, however, wasn't finished. His response revealed a desperation that made him more dangerous than ever. Under cover of a heavy snowstorm, he gathered his most loyal men for one final strike, not at the settlement's supplies or defenses, but at the heart of the resistance itself. "Riders coming," Daniel called from his observation post near Anderson's farm. Moving fast through Blackwood Forest using the storm for cover, Anderson, who'd been checking his winter wheat, merely nodded. His calm demeanor belied the tactical calculations Sarah could see working behind his eyes. "How many? 20, maybe 30. They're split into 3 groups, trying to stay hidden in the tree line." "Good." Anderson's response surprised everyone. "A present." "They're doing exactly what the terrain forces them to do," Sarah understood first. "You've been preparing for this since summer, haven't you? Even the way you planted your crops." Anderson smiled slightly. "Every field, every fence line, every patch of uncleared ground, they all serve a purpose. Webb thinks he's choosing his approach. Instead, he's following paths I laid out months ago. The Iron Riders' attack strategy would have been impressive against a normal settlement. 3 coordinated groups using the winter storm for cover, approaching from different directions to split any defensive response. But Willow Creek Valley was far from normal. "Watch," Anderson instructed Daniel as they moved to a prepared position. "Webb's forgotten the most important lesson about winter warfare. It's not just about dealing with the cold and snow. It's about understanding how they changed the battlefield." The first sign that Webb's attack was going wrong came when his eastern group suddenly found themselves bogged down in what appeared to be solid ground. Anderson's careful irrigation work during the summer had created patches of soil that turned treacherous when frozen and thawed. The crops weren't just planted for food, Daniel realized, watching through the spyglass. The root systems changed how the ground freezes. "Smart boy, and what else do you notice?" Daniel studied the struggling riders. "They're bunching up, trying to find solid ground, but that's putting them right where the old Miller's Creek bed runs." On cue, a series of controlled avalanches, triggered by carefully placed charges Anderson had set months ago, sent waves of snow cascading down the valley's eastern slope. The Iron Riders found themselves cut off, forced to retreat along the only clear path, one that led them directly into the sights of Sheriff Hayes and his deputies. Webb's western group faced different challenges. The seemingly random pattern of winter wheat plantings had created lanes of deep snowdrifts, channeling the riders exactly where Anderson wanted them. They emerged from the forest to find themselves facing not frightened farmers, but a well-organized militia led by Samuel. "Blackwood himself. You taught us well," Blackwood called out to his former companions, "but Anderson taught us better." The central group, led by Webb himself, made it furthest into the valley. But with each step, they found themselves more thoroughly entangled in Anderson's careful preparations. Fences that seemed randomly placed funneled them into natural bottlenecks. Fields that appeared empty concealed hidden observers. Even the morning sun worked against them, positioned perfectly to blind riders emerging from the forest's shadow. Anderson watched it all from his position near the church. his Spencer carbine ready but unfired. "Notice anything familiar?" he asked Sarah, who'd insisted on staying by his side. She studied the unfolding scene, understanding dawning in her eyes. "You've recreated the same trap that caught Webb's brother, but bigger. You're not just using the landscape, you're using their own expectations against them. The best strategy isn't about overwhelming force," Anderson nodded. "It's about giving your opponent exactly what they expect, until it's too late for them to realize their mistake." Webb's frustration showed in increasingly erratic decisions. He pushed his men harder, trying to break through the invisible net, closing around them. But each move only entangled them further in Anderson's carefully laid trap. The end, when it came, was both dramatic and anticlimactic. Webb's men, separated, cold, and thoroughly outmaneuvered, began surrendering in small groups. They found themselves disarmed, not by violence, but by the simple fact that they had no good options left. Jack Webb himself made one final, desperate charge toward Anderson's position. But as he emerged from a snow squall, he found himself facing not just Anderson, but representatives from every settlement his Iron Riders had terrorized. Each held evidence of his crimes, documented and witnessed according to territorial law. "It's over, Jack," Anderson called out, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet valley. "The railroads abandoned you. Your men are surrendering. You've got no ground left to stand on, literally or legally." Webb's response was a bitter laugh. "You think this ends with me? There'll always be others. Men with guns, with money, with power. You can't fight them all with your clever tricks and legal papers." "No," Anderson agreed, stepping forward. "But we can make it harder for them every single time. Each community we teach, each connection we build, each legal precedent we establish, they all become seeds that grow into something stronger than fear." "Then I'll burn it all down," Webb snarled, his hand dropping to his gun. "One last fire to end what my brother started." But before he could draw, something unexpected happened. Snow from the church roof, carefully packed and positioned, over months of preparation, cascaded down, spooking his horse. Webb found himself thrown, landing hard in a carefully prepared patch of half-frozen mud. As he struggled to rise, he found himself surrounded not by armed men eager for revenge, but by ordinary people holding pieces of paper, witness statements, property deeds, documented evidence of every crime the Iron Riders had committed. "You're right about one thing," Anderson said, approaching his fallen opponent. "There will always be men who think violence is the quickest path to power. But what we've built here isn't just about stopping you. It's about showing others that there's a stronger way to fight, a better way to protect what matters." As Webb was taken into custody, the full scope of Anderson's strategy revealed itself. Every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every carefully documented incident formed part of a legal case so comprehensive that not even the railroad's expensive lawyers could dismantle it. "But it's more than just evidence against Webb," Colonel Whitfield observed, surveying the gathered documents. "You've created a template that other communities can use, a way to fight back against corporate power that doesn't rely on violence." Anderson nodded, watching as federal marshals began processing the captured Iron Riders. "Laws are like weapons, Colonel. Their effectiveness depends not just on their power, but on how well people know how to use them." The aftermath of Webb's defeat brought changes nobody had expected. The railroad, facing increasing scrutiny from federal investigators and shareholders alike, was forced to revise its entire approach to expansion. Instead of forcing their way through territories, they began negotiating with communities, using the very legal framework Anderson had helped establish. "They've realized something important," Anderson explained to Daniel during one of their evening lessons. "It's cheaper to work with communities than to fight them. Every settlement we taught, every legal precedent we established made their old methods more expensive and less effective. Sarah, who had been instrumental in organizing the documentation effort, saw the deeper implications. You didn't just teach us to defend ourselves, you taught us to change the rules of the game itself. The spring that followed brought more than just new growth to the territory. It brought a transformation in how communities viewed themselves and their relationships with power. The network Anderson had helped build continued to grow, but now it carried more than just warnings and support. It carried knowledge about rights, about law, about how to turn corporate strength into corporate responsibility. "Look there," Anderson pointed out to Daniel one morning, indicating a group of railroad surveyors working with local farmers to plan the rail line's route. That's real victory, not defeating enemies, but turning them into partners. The surveyors weren't just planning a rail line anymore. They were working with communities to ensure the route benefited local trade, respected water rights, and provided fair compensation for any land used. The railroad had learned that cooperation yielded better returns than confrontation. But perhaps the most significant change was in the territory's people themselves. They no longer saw themselves as isolated settlers at the mercy of powerful forces. They had become something more, a network of communities that understood their own strength, that knew how to use the law as effectively as any weapon, that could turn corporate power into community benefit. As winter's last snow melted into spring mud, Anderson stood on his porch, watching new growth emerge in his fields. The wheat he'd planted as part of his defensive strategy now promised a bountiful harvest. The irrigation channels that had helped. Trapwebb's men would water crops that would feed communities across the territory. "You're smiling," Sarah observed, joining him on the porch. "What do you see?" "Growth," Anderson replied, his eyes scanning the valley. "Not just in the fields, but in the people. Every lesson we learned defending ourselves has become a seed for something better." The territory would face other challenges, other men like Webb, who thought power came from the barrel of a gun or the weight of a money clip. But they would find themselves confronting something they didn't expect. Communities that knew their strength lay not in weapons or wealth, but in their connections to each other and their understanding of how to use the law to protect what mattered. As spring painted the valley in shades of new green, Anderson's lessons continued to spread, taking root in fertile ground, growing into something stronger than any fence or fortress. He had shown that the most powerful weapon isn't the gun in a man's hand or the money in his pocket, but the knowledge in his mind and the connections in his community. The legacy of Willow Creek Valley wasn't just in defeating Webb and his Iron Riders. It was showing that there's always another way to fight, another path to victory that doesn't require becoming what you're fighting against. Anderson had planted seeds of change that would continue growing long after the last shot was fired. The last legal document filed, the last fence mended. For in the end, the strongest defense isn't built of wood or stone or legal papers. It's built of people who understand their own strength, who know how to stand together, who can turn their opponent's power into their own protection. And like any well-tended crop, that kind of strength only grows stronger with each passing season. Summer bloomed across the Nebraska territory, bringing with it changes nobody could have predicted when Anderson first arrived in Willow Creek Valley. The railroad tracks, now laid with the cooperation of local communities, glinted in the morning sun. But they weren't just tracks anymore. They were physical proof that power could be turned from a weapon into a tool for mutual benefit. "Rider coming!" Daniel called from his observation post, though his tone held none of the tension it once did. "Looks like one of the new federal marshals." The marshal who rode up to Anderson's fence carried himself with the easy confidence of a man who knew his authority came from law rather than force. "Got some interesting news from Washington," he announced, dismounting. "They're using your legal framework as a model for new territorial regulations. Seems the president himself took notice of how things changed out here." Anderson, checking his cornrows with practiced care, merely nodded. "How are they applying?" Every new railroad expansion, every corporate land deal has to follow the protection protocols you established. Communities get fair representation, proper compensation, legal oversight. They're calling it the Willow Creek Standard. Sarah, who had joined them, caught the subtle shift in Anderson's expression. You knew this would happen, didn't you? Not just changing how one territory handled corporate power, but creating a template for others to follow. The best seeds, Anderson replied, examining a cornstalk with careful attention, are the ones that spread on their own, taking root wherever the ground is fertile. But peace, like any crop, requires constant attention. The territory's transformation had drawn notice from others, not just legitimate businesses and settlers, but men who saw opportunity in disruption. The first warning came from an unexpected source. Samuel Blackwood rode in one morning, his expression grave. Got word from my contacts down south. Remember the Carson brothers, the ones who used to run protection rackets along the Mexican border? Anderson's eyes narrowed slightly. They're moving north? With a new scheme. They've seen how the railroad had to change, how corporate power got regulated. Now they're offering themselves as consultants to companies wanting to avoid those regulations, teaching them how to pressure communities legally, find loopholes in the protection protocols. Interesting, Anderson said, though his tone suggested he'd been expecting something like this. They're trying to turn our own methods against us. That's not all, Blackwood continued. They're recruiting lawyers, surveyors, even some informer territorial officials, building what they call a business solutions company. Daniel, who had been listening intently, spoke up. But isn't that good? They're not using guns anymore. They're following the law. Anderson smiled at his young student's observation. They're following the letter of the law, son, while trying to break its spirit. It's a different kind of threat, more subtle, more dangerous in some ways than men like Webb who fought with guns. So how do we fight them? Sarah asked. The same way we always have, Anderson replied, but his eyes held that distant look. That meant he was seeing patterns others might miss. By preparing our ground, strengthening our connections, and understanding that sometimes the best defense isn't stopping an attack, but making it work against itself. Over the next few days, Anderson's strategy began to take shape. He gathered community leaders, legal experts, and even some of the railroad's representatives who had learned the value of cooperation. Together, they began examining the territory's legal framework, not for weaknesses to exploit, but for strengths to reinforce. Look here, he pointed out during one meeting, spreading maps and documents across the church's old planning table. The Carson brothers think they've found gaps in the regulations, ways to pressure communities legally. But what they don't understand is that we didn't just create laws, we created connections. Colonel Whitfield, now promoted to territorial commander, nodded in understanding. Every time they try to isolate a community for pressure, they'll find themselves dealing with an entire network, Anderson finished. Not just neighboring settlements, but businesses that have learned the value of fair dealing. Officials who understand that protecting community rights benefits everyone. The plan that emerged wasn't just about defending against the new threat. It was about transforming it, just as they had transformed the railroad's approach. Anderson began teaching communities not just how to resist pressure, but how to turn corporate interest into community benefit. The Carson brothers think they're being clever, he explained to Daniel during one of their observation lessons, using legal methods instead of guns. But they've given us an opportunity to show that the strongest defense isn't in resisting change, but in shaping how that change happens. The first test came sooner than expected. A mining company, guided by the Carson brothers' consultants, attempted to pressure a small settlement north of Willow Creek Valley. They found themselves facing not scared homesteaders, but a community prepared with detailed water surveys, documented land claims, and established business relationships with neighboring settlements. They tried to offer below-market prices for mineral rights, the settlement's leader reported, a note of pride in his voice. We showed them our cooperative agreement with the railroad, our contracts with 3 other mining operations. Suddenly, their consultants were the ones looking worried. Anderson's network had evolved beyond simple defense. Communities weren't just sharing warnings and support anymore. They were sharing business knowledge, legal expertise, development opportunities. The Carson brothers found themselves facing something they hadn't expected: settlements that understood corporate interests as well as they understood their own rights. But it's more than just business, Sarah observed, watching Anderson mark new connections on his ever-growing maps. You're teaching people to think differently about power itself. Power's like water, Anderson replied, his farmer's wisdom mixing with his scout's strategy. Try to dam it up, and it builds until it breaks through. But learn to channel it, to direct it where it can do the most good. He gestured at the thriving valley around them. Then it becomes something that helps things grow. As summer deepened into autumn, the Carson Brothers Business Solutions Company found itself facing an unexpected problem. Communities weren't just refusing their pressure tactics. They were offering better alternatives. Settlements that understood their own value, that knew how to negotiate from strength rather than fear, proved more attractive to legitimate businesses than any. High-pressure tactics. They're learning what the railroad learned, Blackwood remarked, watching another mining company sign a fair-dealing agreement with a group of settlements. Working with communities brings better returns than working against them. But Anderson knew the territory's transformation wasn't complete. Other challenges would come. Other men would see opportunity in disruption. The difference now was in how communities would meet those challenges, not as isolated settlers fighting alone, but as connected networks that understood their own strength. One crisp autumn morning, Anderson took Daniel to the highest ridge overlooking Willow Creek Valley. The view spread out before them like a living map, the railroad tracks curving through cooperating communities, mining operations working in harmony with local water rights, new settlements rising with careful attention to both defense and development. "What do you see?" Anderson asked his young apprentice. Daniel studied the landscape with the careful attention his mentor had taught him. "Growth," he answered finally. "Not just in the fields or buildings, but in how everything connects. Every new path, every trading post, every agreement makes the whole territory stronger. Good. Now look there." Anderson pointed to where the Carson brothers' representatives were meeting with a coalition of settlement leaders. "What's different about that meeting compared to how such things went a year ago? They're not trying to pressure anyone," Daniel observed. "They're negotiating, actually listening. Because they've learned something crucial." Anderson nodded. "In this territory, strength doesn't come from how much pressure you can apply. It comes from how well you can work with others." The meeting below demonstrated this truth. The Carson Brothers Company, finding their pressure tactics ineffective, had begun adapting, learning to offer genuine partnerships rather than threats, to seek community benefit rather than pure profit. They discovered that their knowledge of business and law could be more profitable when used to build rather than break. "You didn't just change how communities defend themselves," Sarah remarked later that evening as they reviewed reports from settlements across the territory. "You changed how power itself works here." Anderson's smile held the wisdom of both farmer and strategist. "The strongest change isn't the one you force on people. It's the one that takes root naturally, because everyone sees its value." The territory's transformation had drawn attention from beyond its borders. Representatives from other territories began arriving, seeking to understand how Willow Creek Valley had achieved what many thought impossible, turning corporate power from a threat into a partner. "But it's not just about copying our methods," Anderson cautioned during a gathering of community leaders. "Each territory, each settlement, has to find its own way. What works here might need adaptation elsewhere. The key is understanding the principles behind the practices. Those principles were already spreading, taking root in fertile ground far beyond Willow Creek Valley. Communities learned that their strength lay not in isolation, but in connection, not in resistance alone, but in transformation. They discovered that the best defense against pressure wasn't just saying no, it was offering better alternatives. Colonel Whitfield, reviewing reports of the territory's growing prosperity, summed it up best. You've shown that the strongest fortress isn't built of walls and guns, but of shared interests and mutual benefit. Every attempt to break these communities now only makes them stronger. As winter approached once again, Anderson stood on his porch, watching the first snow dust his fields. The wheat he'd planted as part of his defensive strategy now fed communities across the territory. The irrigation channels that had once trapped Webb's raiders now nourished crops that supported thriving settlements. "Another rider coming," Daniel called from his observation post, though such announcements had long since lost their tension. "Looks like more corporate representatives." "Good," Anderson replied, surprising the boy. "Each one that comes looking." To apply pressure leaves understanding something different about how power really works. They become seeds themselves, carrying these lessons back to their companies. The territory would face other challenges, other men who thought they could turn progress into pressure. But they would find themselves confronting something unexpected, communities that understood that true strength grows from cooperation rather than confrontation, from transformation rather than resistance. For Anderson had planted something more, valuable than any crop, the knowledge that the most powerful weapon isn't the gun in a man's hand or the money in his pocket, but the understanding in his mind and the connections in his community. And like any well-tended field, that knowledge would continue growing, season after season, yielding harvests more precious than gold. The years painted their own story across Willow Creek Valley, each season adding new chapters to the legend of how one man's wisdom transformed a territory. Anderson's farm remained, though it had evolved into something few would have recognized from those early days when a quiet farmer first arrived with secrets in his past and hope in his hands. "Hard to believe it's been 5 years," Sarah mused, standing with Anderson on his porch one autumn morning. The valley spread before them, a testament to how patience and preparation could change not just land, but lives. "Time's like soil," Anderson replied, studying the horizon with the same careful attention he'd once used to spot raiders. "What matters isn't how much passes, but what grows in it." And much had grown indeed. The railroad tracks that once threatened to divide communities now connected them, carrying not just goods, but ideas across the territory. The mining operations that might have stripped the land instead worked in harmony. With it, guided by agreements that protected both progress and preservation, Daniel, now 15 and showing the same quiet strength his mentor had recognized years ago, rode up with news from the territorial capital. "They're expanding the program," he announced, dismounting with practiced ease, "taking what we built here and establishing training centers across 3 territories." Anderson nodded, though his eyes held that distant look that meant he was seeing patterns others might miss. "Tell me what you see in that, the way I taught you," Daniel thought carefully before answering. "It's like when you taught us about planting windbreaks. One line of trees can protect a field, but when every farm plants them, they change the weather itself." "Good. And what else?" "The centers aren't just teaching defense or farming. They're teaching people how to turn pressure into partnership and how to make growth work for everyone." Anderson smiled at his students' insight. The strongest change isn't the one you force on people. It's the one they choose to embrace because they see its value. The territory had indeed embraced change, though not in the way anyone might have predicted when Anderson first arrived. Communities that once feared corporate power now negotiated with it confidently, understanding that true strength lay not in resistance but in transformation. Colonel Whitfield, now approaching retirement, brought perhaps the most significant news that autumn. Washington's implementing what they're calling the Community Development Act, he reported during one of his regular visits. Based on the frameworks you established here, every territory will have protections, guidelines for corporate community cooperation. And the Carson brothers? Sarah asked, remembering those tense days when legal pressure had threatened to replace armed raids. Their consulting firm is helping implement the new regulations. Whitfield chuckled. Seems they finally understood that helping communities grow strong brings better profits than trying to keep them weak. But Anderson knew that laws and regulations, while important, weren't the heart of what they'd built. The real transformation was in how people thought about power itself, not as something to be seized or resisted, but as something to be channeled and grown, like water nourishing crops. Look there, he pointed out to Daniel one morning, indicating a meeting between settlement leaders and corporate representatives. What do you notice? Daniel studied the gathering with careful attention. They're not negotiating from fear or strength. They're planning together. Each side understands that their success depends on the other. That's the real harvest, Anderson nodded. Not just changes in law or business, but changes in how people see their own power and their connections to others. The valley had become more than just a place. It was a living example of how communities could face pressure without breaking, how they could turn corporate power from a threat into a tool for mutual growth. But with success came new challenges. Ryder. Coming fast, Daniel called one crisp morning. From the Western Territories, the messenger brought word of new pressures building beyond their borders. Land speculators, water monopolies, men who saw the success of Anderson's methods and sought to twist them to their own ends. They think they can use our own techniques against us, the messenger reported grimly, creating fake community organizations, setting up false partnerships. Anderson received this news with his characteristic calm, though those who knew him well saw the subtle shift in his stance, the farmer giving way to the strategist. Good, he said, surprising everyone present. Good? Sarah questioned. How can that be good? Because they're fighting on ground we've already prepared, Anderson explained, pulling out his maps. Every false partnership they create shows communities the value of real ones. Every attempt to manipulate our methods only proves why those methods work in the first place. He gathered the community leaders, not to plan defenses this time, but to share understanding. The strongest protection isn't in the methods themselves, he explained, but in knowing why they work. Anyone can copy techniques, but understanding principles, that's what lets you adapt, grow, transform challenges into opportunities. As winter approached once again, Anderson stood with Sarah and Daniel on the ridge overlooking Willow Creek Valley. The setting sun painted the landscape in shades of gold, highlighting how much had changed since those first tense days. You're leaving, aren't you? Sarah asked. Though she'd known this day would come, Anderson nodded slowly. What we built here is strong now, has deep roots. But there are other valleys, other communities that need to learn these lessons. Like you learned them? Daniel asked. During the war? No, Anderson smiled. Like I learned them here, watching how people can grow stronger together than they ever could alone. The greatest victory isn't in defeating enemies, but in showing them a better way to live. He turned to his young apprentice. You're ready now, Daniel. You understand not just the methods, but the principles behind them. The valley will need that understanding in the years ahead. The next morning, Anderson rode out just as he had arrived years ago, quietly, without ceremony. But he left behind something more valuable than any crop or cattle. He left understanding that had taken root in fertile ground. knowledge that would continue growing and spreading long after he was gone. For in the end, the most powerful force isn't the gun in a man's hand or the money in his pocket, but the wisdom in his mind and the connections in his community. And like any well-tended crop, that force only grows stronger with each passing season, yielding harvests that feed not just bodies, but souls. They say on quiet evenings, when the wind whispers through the wheat fields of Willow Creek Valley, you can still feel the presence of the farmer who taught a territory that the strongest power isn't in fighting or resisting, but in growing something worth protecting. His legend lives on, not in tales of gunfights or violence, but in communities that stand together, in partnerships that build rather than break, in people who understand that true strength grows from wisdom shared and connections nurtured. And somewhere out there, they say, Anderson still rides, seeking new valleys where his unique brand of wisdom can take root and grow, transforming not just land, but lives, one carefully prepared field at a time. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.